Hey everyone, welcome back to your daily dose of what's got the tech world talking. Yesterday was absolutely wild on Hacker News. We reviewed 29 stories, and wow, the community was fired up about everything from AI taking over our coding workflows to the EU potentially destroying digital privacy as we know it. Today, we're diving into the 5 stories that dominated the conversation, and let me tell you, there's a fascinating thread connecting all of them. It's about the gap between what technology promises and what it actually delivers, whether it's LinkedIn's descent into performative mediocrity, the EU's privacy paradox, or the latest AI tools that might be solving problems nobody actually has. We're seeing this pattern everywhere of ambitious tech colliding with messy reality. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's unpack what had everyone hitting that upvote button yesterday. All right, so have you checked LinkedIn lately? Because our first story, Sunny Days Are Warm, Why LinkedIn Rewards Mediocrity, just lit up Hacker News with 450 points and nearly 300 comments. And honestly, it's hitting a nerve that I think we've all been feeling but couldn't quite put our finger on it. You know that feeling when you're scrolling through LinkedIn and you see yet another post that starts with, "I hired someone with 0 experience today," followed by 17 paragraphs about how revolutionary this makes them as a leader? Yeah, that's what we're talking about here. The author introduces this brilliant concept called toxic mediocrity, and it's different from toxic positivity or toxic masculinity because it's softer, it's warm. It masquerades as meaningful content while actually saying absolutely nothing of value. The piece really digs into how LinkedIn has transformed from what was essentially a digital resume holder, remember when that's all it was, into this bizarre content mill where people feel compelled to share what their divorce taught them about B2B sales. I'm not making that up. That's literally an example from the article. And the thing is, this isn't just annoying, it's actually harmful because it creates this entire ecosystem where everyone's performing this weird corporate theater that nobody actually believes in, but everyone participates in anyway. What really got me was the parallel the author draws to SEO content farms. You know those articles that are clearly written just to rank on Google? 10 ways to boil water or whatever. LinkedIn's become the professional version of that. People aren't sharing insights because they have something valuable to say. They're posting because the algorithm demands constant engagement, and the algorithm rewards this kind of vapid, feel-good nonsense that looks profound if you don't think about it too hard. Now, the Hacker News discussion on this, wow, it's absolutely divided. You've got people like Nick from Seattle who's basically saying, "You're all wrong. I've made millions through LinkedIn. You just don't understand marketing." And look, fair point. He argues that in B2B sales cycles that can stretch 3 to 5 years, you need that constant presence to build trust. But then you've got the other camp pointing out the mental health toll of maintaining this fake professional persona all the time. There's this fascinating tension in the comments between people who see LinkedIn as a necessary evil, like, yeah, it's terrible, but it's where the jobs are, and those who've just given up entirely. One commenter, mostly static, actually makes the case that LinkedIn is their main social network now that Twitter's imploded, and they're finding genuine technical content there. They're basically saying, look, if you curate your feed properly, it can actually be good. But here's what strikes me. Even the defenders aren't really defending the content. They're defending the utility. It's like we've all collectively agreed that LinkedIn is this performative nightmare, but some people have figured out how to game the system effectively enough that it's worth the soul-crushing experience of participating. The author makes this point about how toxic mediocrity is harder to call out than other forms of toxicity because it presents itself as helpful. When someone posts about their morning routine and how it relates to synergistic management principles or whatever, you can't really attack it without looking like a jerk. It's weaponized blandness. And honestly, the fact that this got 377 comments tells you everything. People are desperate to talk about this because we're all trapped in this system where your professional success increasingly depends on your willingness to participate in this theater of mediocrity. One commenter mentioned getting actual anxiety from the pressure to build in public and maintain their professional brand. And yeah, that resonates. The really insidious part is that LinkedIn knows exactly what it's doing. They've created a platform where the incentives push everyone toward this lowest common denominator content because that's what drives engagement. And engagement drives ad revenue. It's the same playbook every social media platform uses, but somehow it feels worse when it's wrapped in this veneer of professionalism and career development. So, where does this leave us? Well, LinkedIn's not going anywhere. It's too embedded in the hiring process, too central to professional networking. But maybe, just maybe, if enough people start calling out this toxic mediocrity for what it is, we can start to shift the culture. Or we'll all just keep posting about how our morning coffee taught us about scalable business solutions. Time will tell. Speaking of corporate theater and institutional hypocrisy, our next story takes this theme to a whole new level. If you thought LinkedIn's performative culture was bad, wait until you hear what the EU is up to with digital privacy. All right, now we're diving into something that's got the hacker news community absolutely fired up. GDPR meant nothing. Chat control ends privacy for the EU. This one pulled in over 400 points and nearly 350 comments. And honestly, after digging through the discussion, I can see why people are so worked up about this. So here's what's happening. The EU, the same entity that makes you click through cookie banners on every single website you visit, is now pushing forward with something called chat control. And the irony here is just, it's almost too perfect, right? On one hand, they're fining companies millions of euros for not getting proper consent to track your shopping habits. But on the other hand, they're proposing legislation that would essentially scan all your private messages. The commenters are calling this out as pure hypocrisy, and I've got to say, they have a point. One person in the thread put it perfectly. They said it's like having a bouncer who checks your ID at the door, but then installs cameras in all the bathroom stalls. The disconnect is jarring. What makes this particularly concerning is the scope we're talking about here. This isn't just about WhatsApp or Signal. Based on what the community's discussing, the proposal is so vaguely worded that it could potentially cover any online service where people communicate: email, gaming platforms, probably even comment sections. One commenter pointed out that the technical language is deliberately broad, which, let's be honest, that's never a good sign when it comes to surveillance legislation. And here's where it gets really interesting. The whole thing is being sold as protecting children, which, look, nobody's against protecting kids, but the hacker news crowd is deeply skeptical about this justification. And they're bringing up some valid historical precedents. Remember when anti-terrorism laws were just for catching terrorists? Yeah, now they're used for everything from drug crimes to tax evasion. One commenter shared this chilling point about how these systems always expand beyond their original purpose. They start with think of the children, then it becomes about terrorism, then misinformation, and before you know it, it's about anyone who opposes the current government. The technical implications are honestly mind-boggling. Several people in the thread who clearly know their stuff are explaining why client-side scanning, which is what this would require, is fundamentally incompatible with end-to-end encryption. You can't have both. It's like saying you want a locked door that only you have the key to, but also the government should be able to walk through it whenever they want. The math just doesn't work that way. What really struck me in the discussion was the sense of betrayal from the European tech community. These are people who've been champions of GDPR, who held up the EU as this bastion of digital rights compared to the surveillance capitalism of the US and the authoritarianism of China. And now they're watching their own governments push for something that would make the NSA jealous. There's this fascinating debate in the comments about whether the big tech companies would even comply. Someone brought up WhatsApp specifically, suggesting that if Meta pulled WhatsApp from Europe, there'd be riots in the streets. And you know what? They might not be wrong. WhatsApp is how millions of Europeans communicate daily, with family, for work, for everything. The market pressure might actually be stronger than the regulatory pressure here. But then you've got the contrarian view, and I think it's worth considering. One commenter, Wolf's Echoes was their username, basically said, look, this is just how it's always been. There's always tension between institutions and public interests. This is nothing new. And in a way, they're right. We've been having this privacy versus security debate since forever. But I think what makes this different is the scale and the technology involved. We're not talking about opening physical mail anymore. We're talking about algorithmic scanning of billions of messages in real time. The really scary part that multiple commenters brought up is a slippery slope argument. And usually I'm skeptical of slippery slope arguments, but they're making some compelling points. Once you have the infrastructure to scan for child abuse material, what's stopping you from adding a few more algorithms? Maybe scan for hate speech, then misinformation, then political dissent. The technical capability would already be there. It's just a matter of updating the parameters. And this brings us to the fundamental question that's threading through this entire discussion. Have we already lost the privacy war? Is GDPR just theater while the real surveillance apparatus gets built behind the scenes? The title of the article, GDPR Meant Nothing, that's a pretty bold claim. But when you look at what's being proposed, you start to wonder if maybe all those cookie banners were just a distraction from the real privacy violations being planned. The community reaction here is intense, and it should be. This isn't some abstract technical debate. This is about whether private communication can exist in the digital age. And if the EU, of all places, gives up on that principle, where does that leave the rest of us? Now, shifting gears from privacy concerns to the world of AI and automation, because if there's one thing that dominated yesterday's discussions alongside privacy, it was the explosion of AI tools and whether they're actually solving real problems or just creating new ones. Let's start with something genuinely innovative in the AI space. All right, so our next story is absolutely fascinating. It's about LL3M, which stands for Large Language 3D Modelers, and this one really got the Hacker News crowd fired up with over 400 points and 173 comments. Now imagine if you could just describe what you want in 3D and have AI write the actual Python code to build it in Blender. That's essentially what researchers from the University of Chicago have created here. What's really clever about this approach is they're not trying to have the AI directly generate 3D meshes or voxels or whatever. Instead, they're having teams of language models write Python scripts that interface with Blender's API. And I mean teams of AI agents working together, critiquing each other's work, iterating on designs. It's like having a little AI design studio running inside your computer. The way it works is pretty sophisticated. You've got this three-phase pipeline, where first, the system creates an initial 3D model based on your description. Then, and this is where it gets interesting, it automatically critiques its own work. Like, if it creates a chair with a backrest that's just floating there, disconnected from the seat, it'll catch that and fix it. No human intervention needed. And then finally, you can jump in and guide the refinement process yourself. But here's where the community reaction gets really interesting. The Hacker News discussion basically split into two camps. And honestly, both sides make compelling points. On one side, you've got experienced 3D artists who are basically saying this is useless. There's this user, EtherLord87, who's been using Blender for 7 years, and they're arguing that you'd literally be better off spending a few hours learning basic Blender than trying to use this tool. They're saying the output is, and I quote, bland, and that any decent artist could create better results in minutes. And then there's Rambo Johnson, who didn't hold back at all, calling the output AI trash with grotesque polygon counts. They're pointing out that the AI makes choices no sane artist would ever make, which, harsh, but maybe not entirely unfair when you look at some of the examples. But on the other side, you've got people who see real potential here, and I think they're looking at it from a different angle. They're not comparing it to what a skilled artist can do. They're thinking about all the people who need 3D assets but don't have the time or inclination to learn Blender. For them, even a bland chair that's automatically generated might be exactly what they need for their prototype or visualization. What I find most intriguing, though, is this idea of using code as the 3D representation itself. Unlike these black box AI systems where you get a mesh and you have no idea how it was made, with LL3M, you get actual Python code. You can read it, understand it, modify it. There's this transparency that you don't get with other AI 3D generation methods. It's almost like the difference between getting a compiled program versus getting the source code. The discussion also veered into some really interesting territory about alternative AI workflows. People were talking about tools like Meshy.ai that can convert images to 3D models, and there's this emerging idea of hybrid workflows, where maybe AI gives you a starting point and then you refine it manually. One user mentioned they use AI to generate reference images first, then model based on those, which that's actually pretty clever. And this whole conversation really highlights something bigger about where creative software is heading. The fact that Blender has such a comprehensive Python API is what makes this possible in the first place. Same with After Effects, FreeCAD, all these tools that prioritize scriptability. We're seeing this shift where the API becomes almost more important than the GUI because it opens up these possibilities for AI automation. Now, is LL3M going to replace 3D artists? Absolutely not. The quality gap is real, and the Hacker News community made that crystal clear. But as a research project, exploring how multiple AI agents can collaborate to create complex outputs through code generation, that's genuinely innovative. And who knows, maybe version 2 or 3 of this approach will start producing results that even the skeptics can't dismiss. The real question isn't whether this specific tool is production ready. It's clearly not. It's whether this approach of having AI write code to create content rather than generating the content directly represents a new paradigm for AI-assisted creation. And based on the heated discussion this generated, I'd say we're onto something worth watching. Speaking of AI tools that might be solving problems we didn't know we had, let's talk about another tool that sparked debate yesterday. But first, let's look at something that developers have actually been asking for. All right, now let's dive into something that's got the TypeScript community buzzing. Node.js is now able to execute TypeScript files without any additional configuration. Yeah, you heard that right. No build steps, no transpilation setup, just straight up running TypeScript files like they're regular JavaScript. So here's what's happening. Node.js version 22.18.0 LTS just dropped this experimental feature that lets you literally just type nodefile.ts and boom, it runs. No webpack config, no tsconfig.json dance, no build directory to manage. They're doing this through something called type stripping, which basically means Node is just ignoring all the TypeScript type annotations at runtime and executing what's left. Now, I've got to say, this is pretty huge for developer experience. Think about it. One of the biggest barriers to TypeScript adoption has always been that initial setup friction. You want to write some TypeScript? Great. First, configure your build toolchain, set up your transpiler, figure out source maps. It's like, sometimes you just want to write some typed code and see it run, you know? This completely removes that barrier. It's especially game-changing for beginners who are trying to learn TypeScript or for quick prototyping when you don't want to mess with a whole build setup. But, and there's always a but, right? This feature comes with some pretty significant asterisks. First off, it's experimental, which in Node.js land means use at your own risk in production. More importantly, because they're using type stripping rather than full transpilation, you don't get access to all TypeScript features. Enums? Nope. Decorators? Not happening. Basically, anything that requires actual code transformation rather than just removing types isn't supported. The Hacker News discussion on this is fascinating because it really shows the divide in the community. With 397 points and 225 comments, people have opinions. Some folks are calling this misleading. Like, if you can't use enums, is it really executing TypeScript? One commenter pointed out something pretty critical. This won't work for TypeScript files in your node_modules folder. So if you're thinking you can now publish TypeScript packages directly to NPM and have them just work, not quite there yet. There's also this interesting thread comparing it to Bun, which has had native TypeScript support from day one. Several people are basically asking, why not just use Bun? And honestly, it's a fair question. Bun not only supports TypeScript natively, but apparently does it with better performance and without these syntax limitations. But here's where I think the discussion gets really interesting. One commenter made this point that maybe we're thinking about this wrong. They argued that what we really need isn't TypeScript support in Node, but TypeScript support in browsers. Because let's be honest, setting up TypeScript in a Node project isn't that hard. You add a build step to your package.json, and you're done. But imagine if browsers could just run TypeScript directly. That would be revolutionary for web development. There's also this concern that keeps popping up in the comments about what this means for TypeScript as a language. Some developers worry that features like this will push people to use TypeScript purely as a type checker, basically JavaScript with training wheels, rather than leveraging its more powerful transpilation features. Like TypeScript can do some really cool stuff with decorators, with enum optimization, with const assertions, but if everyone starts using this stripped-down version because it's convenient, do we lose some of what makes TypeScript special? You know what, though? Despite all the limitations and concerns, I think this is still a net positive. Perfect is the enemy of good, and for a lot of use cases, scripts, development environments, quick prototypes, this is more than good enough. And the fact that you can disable it with a flag if you don't want it, that's smart. They're not forcing this on anyone. The real test will be seeing how this evolves. Will they expand support to more TypeScript features? Will this push other projects to improve their TypeScript stories? Will this actually increase TypeScript adoption like everyone hopes? Time will tell, but for now, if you're on Node 22.18.0 LTS, go ahead and try running that .ts file directly. It's pretty satisfying to see it just work. And speaking of AI coding tools, and the question of whether we're building solutions to real problems, our final story really brings this theme full circle. All right, so our final story has me feeling a bit conflicted, and I think it perfectly captures where we're at with AI coding tools right now. We're talking about Claudia, that's Claudia, which is a desktop companion app for Claude Code. And wow, this one sparked quite the debate on Hacker News with 383 points and nearly 200 comments. So here's the thing. We've all been there, right? You're using Claude or ChatGPT to help with coding, you're copying and pasting between your terminal and the browser, maybe juggling multiple conversations, and someone thinks, hey, what if we made a nice desktop app for this? And that's essentially what Claudia is trying to be, a GUI wrapper that sits on top of Claude's coding capabilities. But here's where it gets interesting and honestly where the community really let loose. The overwhelming sentiment in the comments is basically, do we really need this? And I'm not saying that to be harsh, but there's this palpable sense of fatigue in the discussion. One commenter compared it to that phase we went through years ago where everyone and their cousin was building a Twitter client. Remember that? Every week there'd be a new one with slightly different features, and after a while you just stopped caring. The technical issues people are reporting, though, those are pretty rough. Users are talking about UI sluggishness, scrolling problems that make the app basically unusable, image handling that's completely broken. One person couldn't even get it to install properly. And look, I get it. Building desktop apps is hard, especially when you're trying to wrap an AI service. But when your value proposition is, we make Claude easier to use, and then your app is harder to use than just using Claude directly, that's a problem. Now, there was this really interesting debate that emerged between GUIs versus terminal interfaces for AI coding. You've got folks like Terhekte who actually went the opposite direction. They started with GUI tools and then moved entirely to a CLI setup with Claude Code, and they're loving it. They're saying it's more enjoyable, more efficient. Basically, the terminal is where it's at. But then, and this is where I think there's actually a valid point, Trevor E. jumps in and says, hold on. When you're running multiple AI agents in parallel, managing different Git work trees, trying to keep track of what each agent is doing, a GUI actually becomes essential. And you know what? They're not wrong. When you've got 3 or 4 Claude sessions going, each working on different parts of your code base, having visual tabs and status indicators, that actually makes sense. The real question that kept coming up, though, and I think this is what we should all be asking ourselves as developers and users, is Is this solving a real problem, or are we just building tools because we can? Because right now it feels like we're in this gold rush phase where everyone's rushing to build X, but for AI, or AI, but with Y interface. And a lot of these tools are solutions looking for problems. What really struck me about this whole discussion is how it reflects where we are in the AI tooling ecosystem right now. We're past the initial, wow, this is amazing phase, and we're into the, okay, but how do we actually integrate this into our workflow phase? And that's messy. It's full of half-baked solutions and redundant tools and things that seemed like good ideas but don't quite work in practice. I mean, think about it. Claude already has a pretty decent interface. It handles code well, it maintains context, it can work with multiple files. So when someone comes along and says, here's Claude, but in a desktop app, the bar is actually pretty high. You're not just competing with nothing anymore, you're competing with something that already works pretty well. And this proliferation of similar tools, it's exhausting, honestly. Multiple commenters mentioned feeling overwhelmed by the sheer number of AI coding assistants, wrappers, enhancers, and companions hitting the market every week. It's like, how many different ways do we need to talk to the same underlying language model? The funny thing is, I actually sympathize with the developer here. They probably saw a genuine pain point in their own workflow, built something to solve it, and thought others might find it useful too. That's how a lot of great tools start. But the execution matters, and from what users are reporting, this one needs a lot more work before it's ready for prime time. And that brings us full circle on today's stories. Looking at everything we covered, from LinkedIn's toxic mediocrity to the EU's privacy paradox, from AI-generated 3D models to Node's TypeScript support, and finally this explosion of AI coding tools, there's this common thread running through all of them: the gap between technological ambition and practical reality. We're living in this fascinating moment where the pace of innovation is absolutely breathtaking. But the human and social infrastructure to actually use these innovations effectively, that's lagging behind. LinkedIn promised professional networking and delivered performative theater. The EU promised digital privacy and might deliver mass surveillance. AI promises to revolutionize creative work and coding, but we're drowning in tools that solve problems we're not sure we have. Maybe that's just the nature of progress. Messy, contradictory, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But what I love about the Hacker News community is that they're not afraid to call it out. Whether it's pointing out that an AI 3D modeler produces bland output, or questioning whether we really need another Claude wrapper, or highlighting the hypocrisy of chat control, this is a community that refuses to drink the Kool-Aid just because it's labeled innovation. Those were your top 5 stories from the 29 that appeared on Hacker News yesterday. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the beautiful chaos of tech discourse. Until tomorrow, keep questioning, keep building, and maybe skip that LinkedIn post about what your breakfast taught you about distributed systems. This has been your Hacker News Daily. See you tomorrow.